a U.S. Navy guided missile cruiser received an order that made no sense. Alter course. Avoid transit corridor Delta 7. Route compromised. Corridor Delta 7 was a standard shipping lane in the central Persian Gulf, a 4 nautical mile wide channel between Iranian claimed waters and the Qatari exclusive economic zone. U.S. warships had transited this corridor thousands of times. It was charted, surveilled, and considered low risk. Now, with no explanation, it was off limits. The cruiser's captain requested clarification. The response from 5th Fleet took 7 minutes. IRGCN assets have deployed a blockade line across Corridor Delta 7. 12 fast boats, hull-to-hull formation, weapons visible. Iranian state media has broadcast a declaration of defensive maritime exclusion zone. Transit is denied by hostile force. Iran had tried to block a U.S. Navy route overnight while the world slept. What happened in the minutes after the Navy decided to break through left the water filled with wreckage, and a question that no diplomat could answer. Had Iran just committed an act of war? Welcome to Warfare Signal, where we break down the most critical military operations shaping global power. To understand why a blockade line across Corridor Delta 7 was not just provocative, but strategically dangerous, you need to understand the corridor itself. Delta 7 connects the central Persian Gulf to the approaches of Bahrain, home to 5th Fleet headquarters, Naval Support Activity Bahrain, and the largest concentration of U.S. naval assets in the Middle East. Approximately 60% of U.S. military vessel traffic to and from Bahrain transits Delta 7, or the adjacent corridor Delta 9. Closing Delta 7 didn't just block a route, it constrained access to the Navy's primary Gulf operating base. Under international maritime law, blocking an international shipping lane with military forces constitutes a blockade, an act of war under established legal precedent. Iran, however, had declared it a defensive maritime exclusion zone, a term with no standing in international law, but one that provided domestic political cover. The blockade was announced at 2300 hours local time via Iranian state television and simultaneously broadcast on maritime radio frequencies. 12 IRGCN fast boats had formed a line approximately 8 nautical miles long across the corridor's widest point. The boats were spaced 600 to 700 meters apart, close enough that their weapons' overlapping fields of fire covered the entire corridor width. Satellite imagery, captured 40 minutes after the announcement, confirmed the formation. 12 Peykop and Boghammer-class vessels, stationary, positioned in a deliberate line across the corridor, running lights on, weapons visible on forward mounts. This was not a hit-and-run swarm attack. This was a planned military blockade designed for maximum visibility. Iran wanted this to be seen. The question facing 5th Fleet Command at 2350 hours was not whether to respond. It was how. Option 1, diplomatic response. Contact Tehran through the Swiss embassy. Demand withdrawal. File a protest at the United Nations. Allow time for negotiation. This option avoided confrontation but conceded the corridor, effectively validating Iran's ability to close international shipping lanes through military force. The precedent would be catastrophic. Option 2, bypass. Route U.S. vessels through Delta 9 or alternative corridors. Avoid the blockade entirely. This avoided immediate confrontation, but still conceded the principle. If Iran could close Delta 7 tonight, it could close Delta 9 tomorrow. Option 3, break the blockade. Transit the corridor with a military force capable of defending itself and demonstrating that Iran cannot close international waterways. This upheld the principle of freedom of navigation, but risked a direct military engagement. 5th Fleet chose option 3. The order went out at 0014 hours. The force assembled was calculated to be overwhelming, not because the Navy needed overwhelming force to break 12 fast boats, but because the political stakes required that the blockade be broken decisively, visibly, and with minimal ambiguity. The lead element was the USS Monterey, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. 9,600 tons, full Aegis combat suite, 2 5-inch guns, harpoon missiles, standard missiles, Phalanx CIWS. A cruiser is essentially a destroyer with more firepower and a flag officer's operations center. It was the most powerful surface combatant available on short notice. Flanking the Monterey were 2 Cyclone-class patrol ships, the USS Tempest and the USS Squall, both armed with Mark 38 chain guns, .50 caliber mounts, and Mark 19 grenade launchers. Overhead, 2 SH-60B Seahawk helicopters, airborne from the Monterey, and the destroyer USS Mahan, which was providing distant support 25 nautical miles to the rear. Both Seahawks carried Hellfire missiles. Additional overhead, an MQ-9 Reaper drone, redirected from a surveillance mission, providing real-time video feed to 5th Fleet Command, CENTCOM in Tampa, and the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon. The White House Situation Room was activated at 0020 hours. The National Security Advisor was briefed. The President was informed. At 0043 hours, the 3-ship formation, with helicopter escort and drone surveillance, began its approach to Corridor Delta 7 at 18 knots. The blockade line was 14 nautical miles ahead. At 18 knots, contact in approximately 47 minutes. At 0055, the Monterey's electronic warfare suite detected active radar emissions from the blockade line. Multiple Type 360 surface search radars, consistent with IRGCN, fast boat navigation systems. They were tracking the approaching formation. At 100, the Monterey broadcast a formal warning on VHF Channel 16, on IRGCN monitored frequencies, and on the International Maritime Distress Channel simultaneously. The message was composed by 5th Fleet legal staff and approved by CENTCOM. Attention Iranian naval forces blocking Corridor Delta 7. You are unlawfully obstructing an international maritime transit corridor. United States naval forces are exercising the right of innocent passage. Clear the corridor immediately. Failure to comply will be met with appropriate defensive measures. The message was broadcast 4 times over 10 minutes. At 0110, a response came on Channel 16, Farsi language. Translation: American warships, you are approaching an Iranian defensive exclusion zone. Entry is prohibited. Reverse course or accept full responsibility for consequences. At 0112, the formation reached 8 nautical miles from the blockade line. Speed, maintained at 18 knots. Course, direct approach. The Seahawk helicopters moved ahead of the formation, taking positions at 3,000 feet altitude over the blockade line. Their FLIR pods began broadcasting high-resolution thermal imagery. What they showed was concerning. The 12 boats were not just sitting in a line. 6 of them had what appeared to be anti-ship missile launch rails on elevated mounts, a configuration consistent with Nasr-1 or C-704 short-range missiles. The other 6 carried heavy machine guns in forward and aft mounts. 6 boats with missiles in a blockade line, positioned to engage any vessel that attempted to transit. The formation commander, the Monterey's captain, a veteran captain with Gulf experience spanning 3 deployments, now faced a decision that would be analyzed in war colleges for decades. He could continue the approach and challenge the blockade, risking a missile engagement that could damage or destroy one of his ships. Or he could halt the approach and call for additional assets, carrier-based aircraft, additional surface ships, turning an hours-long confrontation into a days-long standoff. He chose to continue, but he modified the approach. At 115, he ordered the 2 patrol ships to fall back behind the cruiser. The Monterey would lead the transit. Its Aegis system, ESSM point defense missiles, and Phalanx CIWS gave it the best chance of defeating incoming anti-ship missiles. The patrol ships, with no missile defense, would follow in the cruiser's wake. At 120, the formation reached 4 nautical miles. The blockade line was visible on the horizon, running lights marking each boat's position like a string of low stars on the water. Final warning broadcast at 0122. Same message. Same channels. No response this time. Silence. At 0125, the Monterey crossed the 3 nautical mile mark. In naval engagement terms, this is decisive range. The Nasser-1 missile has a minimum engagement range of approximately 3 kilometers. The formation was now within launch parameters. The Aegis system was in full defensive mode. SPY-1B radar actively scanning. ESSM missiles in the vertical launch cells, ready for immediate engagement. Nulka decoys armed, chaff launchers loaded. Electronic warfare suite jamming Iranian targeting frequencies. At 0127, 3 things happened in rapid sequence. First, 2 boats on the blockade line activated targeting radar. The characteristic pulse of Nasser 1 seeker illumination was detected by the SLQ 32 at bearing 005 and 015. Second, the formation commander ordered defensive weapons free. Authorization to engage any unit that demonstrated hostile intent through targeting radar lock. Third, the lead Seahawk helicopter, positioned directly above the blockade line, observed 1 boat's missile launcher elevate to firing position. The helicopter fired first. Hellfire missile. The boat with the elevated launcher was hit amidships. The Nasser-1 missile on its rail detonated in a sympathetic explosion. The fireball was enormous. The missile's 130-kilogram warhead adding to the Hellfire's own blast. The boat was obliterated. Debris rained across a 300-meter radius. A neighboring boat, 600 meters away, was showered with fragments. The second Seahawk engaged the other boat that had activated targeting radar. Hellfire. Impact on the forward section. The boat broke in half. The missile launcher, unfired, tumbled into the water. 2 missile-armed boats destroyed in under 10 seconds. The remaining 10 boats on the blockade line were now facing a cruiser at 2.5 nautical miles with 2 armed helicopters overhead. At 6 boats, those without missiles, turned simultaneously and accelerated northeast toward Iranian waters. They abandoned their positions in the blockade line and fled at maximum speed. The 4 remaining missile-armed boats hesitated. For approximately 15 seconds, they held position. Targeting radars remained off. The destruction of the first 2 boats had clearly communicated what activation would bring. Then, one by one, they turned and followed the others. At 0129, the Monterey's 5-inch gun fired a single round. Not at a specific boat, the round was aimed at the water 200 meters ahead of the last retreating vessel. A final exclamation point. The shell detonated on the surface, sending a geyser of water 50 feet into the air. The message was delivered. At 1:30, the formation entered Corridor Delta 7. The blockade line had disintegrated. The 12 boats, minus 2, were retreating northeast in disorder. The Monterey transited the corridor at 18 knots. The tempest and squall followed. No further engagement. At 0142, the formation cleared Corridor Delta 7 and entered open water en route to Bahrain. The corridor was open. The blockade was broken. Total engagement time, approximately 3 minutes. 2 Iranian boats destroyed. 0 American casualties. 0 damage to U.S. vessels. But the consequences were seismic. Iran had attempted to close an international shipping lane with military force. The United States had responded by destroying the threat and transiting through. The legal, diplomatic, and strategic implications would unfold over months. Within hours, the UN Security Council convened in emergency session. The United States presented satellite imagery, radar data, and helicopter video showing the blockade formation, the targeting radar activation, and the defensive response. The evidence was unambiguous. Russia vetoed a resolution condemning Iran. China abstained. But the footage was broadcast globally. Every maritime nation saw what had happened. And every maritime nation understood the implication. If Iran could block a Gulf corridor, any nation could block any strait anywhere. The Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Bosphorus. The principle of freedom of navigation, the foundation of global trade, had been tested. Iran's narrative was predictable. American warships violated an Iranian exclusion zone and murdered Iranian sailors. State media broadcast the burning wreckage. The two boats' crews, likely 8 to 12 personnel, were declared martyrs. But within the IRGCN, leaked assessments revealed a different calculation. The blockade had been designed as a political gambit, a visible, dramatic action intended to create leverage for ongoing nuclear negotiations. The expectation was that the U.S. would protest diplomatically, reroute traffic, and the blockade would become a bargaining chip. The expectation was not that the U.S. Navy would drive through it at 18 knots and start shooting. The miscalculation cost Iran 2 boats, international credibility, and the leverage it had sought. The nuclear negotiations were suspended for 60 days in the aftermath, but the incident also exposed a vulnerability in the U.S. response. The Monterey's captain, in his after-action report, noted that the 4 missile-armed boats that chose not to fire still held launch-ready weapons. Had they fired simultaneously, 4 Nasr-1 missiles from 4 positions, the cruiser's Aegis system would have been tested against a multi-axis missile salvo at close range. Simulations later run by Naval Warfare Development Command showed a 78% probability of intercepting all 4 missiles, 22% chance of at least one hit, 22% on a 9,600-ton cruiser carrying 400 sailors. The captain broke the blockade, but 22% is not a number anyone sleeps well with. Corridor Delta 7 has remained open since that night. No further blockade attempts have been made. The IRGCN revised its maritime exclusion zone doctrine. The concept was not abandoned, but its execution shifted from static blockade lines to mobile denial patterns that are harder to target. The night the Gulf went dark and Iran tried to draw a line across the water, the U.S. Navy erased it in 3 minutes. But the line was never really about the water. It was about the question underneath. What is America willing to risk to keep the world's shipping lanes open? The answer, that night, was everything. Whether that answer holds the next time depends on numbers no one wants to calculate. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. I'll see you in the next one.